Imagine walking into a store so luxurious, so dripping in chandeliers and marble, that you felt as though you were stepping into a palace, only instead of kings and queens, the rulers here were the cash register, and the thrones, those were the dressing room. The Gilded Age, roughly from the 1870s to the early 1900s, was a time when America's wealthiest families discovered that shopping itself could be a performance. And like any good theatre, you needed a grand stage. And so, the department store was born, not as we know it today with its seasonal sales and fluorescent lighting, but as sprawling palaces of consumption where a woman in a silk gown could spend 3 hours choosing just the right feather for her hat and still leave with 2 new gowns, imported perfume, and maybe a piano. This was shopping as theatre, shopping as identity, and most of all, shopping as proof. Because in a world where fortunes could be made and lost almost overnight, what better way to show you had arrived than by arriving at the grandest store in town? Of course, there's a contrast here, as there always is in the Gilded Age. While a Vanderbilt might have been deciding between Parisian lace or Venetian velvet, just a few blocks away, factory workers were still surviving on stale bread, potatoes, and 12-hour work. It was a city of excess and suffering, opulence and sweatshops, where the same hands that stitched the gowns could never dream of stepping inside the stores that sold them. And tonight, we'll wander together through these palaces of luxury, from Bloomingdale's to Marshall Fields, from Harrods in London to the House of Worth in Paris. We'll see how the world's most extravagant shops defined an era. If you're listening in bed with tired eyes and an overthinking brain, you're in the right place. So let this story carry you, and if you're still awake at the end, I'll be here to say goodnight. Our first stop is in New York City, where 2 brothers, Joseph and Lyman Bloomingdale, opened a small hoop skirt shop in 1861. Now, hoop skirts may sound like an odd foundation for a fashion empire, but remember, in the mid-19th century, skirts weren't just clothing, they were architectural projects. A hoop skirt could span wider than a small dining table, taking up half a room and all of a woman's patience. And yet, they were the must-have accessory of the moment. The Bloomingdale brothers saw their chance and grabbed it. Their little boutique became the talk of the fashionable set, and soon they moved into a larger location in Midtown, right as the city itself was expanding. Timing, as in all retail, was everything. By the 1880s, Bloomingdale's wasn't just a shop, it was a destination. The flagship store at 59th Street and 3rd Avenue sprawled across a full city block, eventually swallowing nearly all of Lexington Avenue. Walking through its halls meant entering a world where you could buy everything from Paris couture gowns to imported silver tea sets, from perfume to fine furniture. And unlike the small specialty shops of earlier decades, Bloomingdale's made it possible for a wealthy shopper to step off her carriage, glide up the grand staircase, and outfit her entire household, wardrobe, kitchen, and drawing room included, without ever leaving the building. To the average New Yorker, it might as well have been another planet. For working-class families who lived crammed into tenement houses where 5 people might share one room, the idea of shopping at Bloomingdale's was about as realistic as buying a castle in France. The store itself, with its glass display windows and glittering chandeliers, was designed to exclude as much as it was to include. The message was clear. If you could afford to be here, you belonged. If you couldn't, well, keep walking. But to the wealthy, Bloomingdale's became a playground. Shopping wasn't just about acquiring things. It was a form of social theatre. Who you were seen with in the store, how long you lingered in the jewelry department, and whether you had parcels carried out to a waiting carriage or delivered discreetly to your Fifth Avenue mansion, all sent a message. You weren't buying just silk or silver. You were buying proof that you had arrived. It's almost funny to think about now, when most of us associate Bloomingdale's with mall anchor stores and seasonal sales. But in the 1880s, Bloomingdale's was as much a symbol of New York wealth as the Vanderbilt mansions. The store's name itself became shorthand for elegant, just as today people might casually say, "I got it at Gucci," or "It's from Tiffany." And in a way, Bloomingdale's trained Americans in the art of consumer identity. To buy was not simply to own, but to become. What began with hoop skirts became high fashion, then full-scale luxury, and Bloomingdale's, unlike many of its Gilded Age rivals, survived. Today, the flagship still stretches across Lexington Avenue, celebrating more than 150 years of existence, its name known worldwide. It may no longer feel like Versailles on a Tuesday afternoon, but once upon a time, Bloomingdale's was a palace of dreams, a glittering hall where wealth and fashion collided under gaslight. If Bloomingdale's taught New York how to shop, Marshall Field's taught Chicago how to dream. Founded in 1852, originally just another dry goods store, it transformed under Marshall Field, a man who understood that shopping could be less about fabric and more about fantasy. Field's motto was legendary: "Give the lady what she wants." That sounds obvious today, but in the 19th century, when stores had haggling, inconsistent prices, and cranky clerks, it was revolutionary. Imagine walking into Walmart and having to negotiate with the cashier over every item. That was shopping before Field. Instead, Field introduced fixed prices, the same for everyone, which made shopping both more dignified and, let's be honest, less exhausting. He added lavish displays, attentive clerks, and policies that bordered on shocking generosity. Returns allowed, no questions asked. To upper-class women who had never been treated as anything other than ornaments in society, Marshall Field's made them feel like queens, at least as long as they kept buying. And the store itself? The flagship on State Street became a temple of consumerism. It was vast and grand, with polished marble columns, chandeliers dripping from ceilings, and its famous Great Hall, which was eventually capped with a Tiffany glass mosaic dome, the largest of its kind in the world. Picture walking into a store and having to tilt your head back like you're inside a cathedral, except instead of stained glass saints, the light glitters across advertisements for perfume and silk gloves. Field also understood something critical about Gilded Age society. Women of wealth had time, hours and hours of it, so he gave them not just shopping, but a social club. His elegant tea room allowed women to dine respectably without male chaperones, a quiet revolution in a time when even walking alone could be frowned upon. Suddenly, shopping wasn't just an errand, it was an outing, an event, a safe space where women could gossip, linger, and of course, spend. The store quickly became the beating heart of Chicago's elite, a place where the wealthy not only flaunted their money, but also rehearsed their roles in the theater of society. A woman's entrance down Marshall Field's grand staircase carried the same weight as stepping into a ballroom. By the early 20th century, Field's was the second largest store in the world, employing thousands and shaping Chicago's very identity. For the rich, it was paradise. For the working-class employees who scrubbed its floors and ran its stockrooms, it was more like purgatory. Still, the store's name was etched into the city's memory. Even today, though it was absorbed into Macy's in 2005, many Chicagoans still stubbornly refuse to call it anything but Marshall Field. Because really, once you've shopped in a palace, Macy's feels a little too ordinary. Now, if Bloomingdale's was about scale and Marshall Field's about spectacle, Henry Bendel was about exclusivity. Opened in 1895 by Henri Bendel, a milliner and designer with a flair for knowing exactly what wealthy women wanted before they did, his little Greenwich Village boutique became a magnet for New York's fashionable elite. He specialized in hats, and in the Gilded Age, a hat wasn't just an accessory, it was practically a social passport. The right hat could gain you entry into the right drawing room. The wrong hat could leave you sipping weak tea at home alone. Bendel's shop sold hats so expensive they could make a Vanderbilt blink, and that was precisely the point. Buying from Henry Bendel wasn't about need, it was about status. To be seen in a Bendel hat was to announce that you were wealthy enough to care about something as frivolous as a 2-foot plume of ostrich feathers dyed the perfect shade of Parisian teal. Soon, Bendel moved uptown to 57th Street, planting himself among the city's rising luxury district. His store expanded to include couture, accessories, jewelry, and even home decor. By the early 20th century, he had become the gatekeeper for American women who wanted Paris fashion without the bother of crossing the Atlantic. He personally traveled to Europe to scout designers, importing couture directly from Paris, often before Paris society itself had fully caught on. And Bendel was clever. He cultivated an aura of exclusivity by keeping his clientele limited. Walking into Henri Bendel was like walking into a private club. Clerks didn't chase customers. Customers chased clerks. It was not uncommon for wealthy socialites to wait weeks for their Bendel hats, parading them afterward like trophies. Of course, beneath the glamour was the absurdity of it. Imagine spending the equivalent of a servant's yearly wages on a hat, only for it to blow into the Hudson River during a windy carriage ride. But that was the essence of the Gilded Age. Extravagance was not only tolerated, it was celebrated. The waste itself was the point. For decades, Henri Bendel remained a symbol of high-class chic. Its signature brown and white striped bags became as recognizable in New York as the Statue of Liberty. But eventually, exclusivity couldn't pay the rent forever. By 2019, Henri Bendel closed its doors, marking the end of an era. Still, during the Gilded Age, Bendel was untouchable. It wasn't about convenience like Bloomingdale's or spectacle like Marshall Field. Bendel was about saying, I can afford to spend more on a hat than you can on your entire wardrobe. And in the Gilded Age, nothing shouted louder than that. If shopping at Bloomingdale's was a pastime and Marshall Field's was theatre, then Harrods was religion. Located in London's Knightsbridge, Harrods became the ultimate symbol of retail grandeur. And while it technically predates the Gilded Age, founded in 1834 by Charles Henry Harrod as a humble grocery shop, by the late 19th century, it had transformed into something so audaciously extravagant that American heiresses crossed the Atlantic just to shop there. Imagine telling your husband, "Sorry, dear, I'm off to buy a pair of gloves," and then boarding a ship to London. That was the Harrods effect. Harrods didn't just sell things. It sold the idea that everything you could ever want, from caviar to canaries, could be found under one ornate roof. Its motto, Omnia Omnibus Ubique, literally, all things for all people, everywhere, was less a slogan and more a threat. If Harrods didn't have it, you probably didn't need it. And if you claimed you did need it, they'd probably find it for you anyway. Exotic pets. Harrods would supply them. Perfumes from Paris, of course. A fresh lion cub for your country estate, not a problem. Yes, this actually happened. Harrods sold lions, panthers, and even elephants to wealthy clients. Today it would be illegal. Back then, it was just good customer service. After a devastating fire in 1883, Harrods rebuilt itself bigger, shinier, and more absurdly opulent. It rose like a palace of commerce with terracotta tiles, domes, and vast windows that made it look less like a shop and more like Buckingham Palace's flashier cousin. And once inside, you were met with an experience that made most American stores look like dusty general shops. Lavish departments showcased silks, jewels, imported wines, fine china, and clothing that cost more than an average worker's lifetime wages. But perhaps the most gasp-worthy innovation came in 1898. Harrods installed one of the world's first escalators. Customers, suspicious of this moving staircase contraption, were reportedly offered brandy at the top to recover from the shock of their journey into the future. Imagine getting tipsy just for making it upstairs to buy hosiery. And then there was the Egyptian Hall, an exotic fever dream of gilded pillars, lotus motifs, and hieroglyphic-inspired design. For Victorian Londoners obsessed with all things Oriental, it was proof that Harrods wasn't just selling products, it was selling experiences. A trip to Harrods was a kind of cultural safari, except instead of risking malaria, you risked your entire bank account. By the end of the Gilded Age, Harrods had cemented itself as the world's most famous department store, the beating heart of global luxury. Even today, its name is synonymous with grandeur. Though the lions and brandy have been swapped out for handbags and lattes, still, the message lingers. Harrods wasn't built to sell you necessity. It was built to remind you that, if you were wealthy enough, the entire world could be carried home in one shopping bag. Just down the road from Harrods was Harvey Nichols, the slightly younger, slightly cooler sibling that knew how to cater to the privileged without all the theatrical excess. Founded in 1831 by Benjamin Harvey as a modest textile shop, it grew steadily, eventually partnering with James Nichols in 1848. By the late 19th century, the store had exploded into a sprawling department store that stood shoulder to shoulder with Harrods in Knightsbridge. But while Harrods was busy impressing customers with escalators and exotic animals, Harvey Nichols went for refinement. It was the place for silks, lace, hosiery, and fashion items chosen with exquisite taste. You went to Harrods if you wanted everything. You went to Harvey Nichols if you wanted the right thing. Think of it as the 19th century version of Apple versus Microsoft. Harrods gave you an overwhelming choice. Harvey Nichols gave you curated exclusivity. The store was demolished and rebuilt in 1889 into a proper Gilded Age palace of commerce with gleaming showrooms and airy spaces designed to flatter both the goods and the customers. Its clientele was made up of society's most privileged women who could browse expensive textiles while discussing their next country house ball. For the elite, Harvey Nichols wasn't just a store, it was a lifestyle accessory, a place where taste and money merged. In fact, while Harrods often gets the spotlight in the history books, Harvey Nichols quietly carved out a reputation for being the more discerning choice. Harrods might sell you an elephant, Harvey Nichols would sell you the gown to wear while riding it. And unlike Harrods' somewhat carnival-like atmosphere, Nichols cultivated a quieter air of sophistication, less spectacle, more polish, less about dazzling you with everything under the sun, more about assuring you that the few things you did buy would be flawless. Still, the rivalry between the two was palpable. Knightsbridge became a shopping battlefield where the rich could flaunt not just their money, but their loyalty. Choosing Harvey Nichols over Harrods was a statement, not unlike choosing today between Prada and Chanel. Both luxurious, both expensive, but each promising a different kind of status. And remarkably, Harvey Nichols still stands today in its original location, expanded and modernized, but always carrying a whiff of its 19th century prestige. From Knightsbridge, it has expanded globally, with locations as far afield as Hong Kong and Dubai, yet its identity remains the same: stylish, elite, and just a little bit smug. So, while Harrods hogged the headlines and the tourist postcards, Harvey Nichols became the insider's choice. The store that whispered, "Yes, darling, anyone can buy luxury, but only the truly refined know where to shop for." If Bloomingdale's and Marshall Field's were temples of consumerism, then the House of Worth in Paris was Olympus itself, and Charles Frederick Worth was Zeus with a tape measure. Worth, a British-born designer who opened his Paris fashion house in 1858, didn't just sell clothes. He invented the concept of haute couture. Before him, wealthy women went to dressmakers who worked largely in anonymity. Worth flipped that dynamic on its head. He declared himself a fashion designer, an artist, and insisted on putting his own name on every gown. Today, we barely bat an eye at designer labels stitched inside our jeans, but in the 19th century, that was radical. Imagine a cook serving dinner and then signing his name on the roast beef. That's what Worth did with dresses, and what dresses they were. His creations were masterpieces of silk, velvet, lace, and embroidery, often so heavy with beads and trim that moving gracefully required both practice and core strength. A single Worth gown could weigh upwards of 20 pounds, less an outfit than a personal gym session. But weight was part of the point. If you could glide effortlessly while wearing half a chandelier, you announced to the world that you were not only fabulously wealthy, but also impressively idle. Worth's clientele included European royalty, aristocrats, and of course, America's Gilded Age heiresses, who sailed across the Atlantic with trunks full of cash to spend. The Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Goulds, all made pilgrimages to his Paris salon. Ordering a Worth gown wasn't about fashion, it was about proving you belonged to a global elite. His dresses often cost more than an American servant's yearly wage, sometimes several times over. But to a Gilded Age matriarch plotting her daughter's marriage into European nobility, no price was too high if it meant the gown dazzled at the ball. Worth also had a flair for theatre. He staged fashion shows with live models, something practically unheard of at the time, so women could see his designs in motion before purchasing. Imagine the 19th century version of a runway show, with aristocrats fanning themselves in astonishment while Worth himself prowled the sidelines, dictating who looked radiant and who looked merely rich. And let's not forget the irony. While the House of Worth was inventing haute couture in Paris, the women who sewed the gowns were often underpaid seamstresses working 14-hour days, their eyesight ruined by gaslight and fine stitches. But in the Gilded Age, the illusion was what mattered. When Consuelo Vanderbilt floated across a ballroom floor in a Worth gown, no one thought about the seamstress who had bled into the hemline. The House of Worth dominated fashion for decades, shaping not just how women dressed, but how they thought about clothing as identity. By the early 20th century, the house's influence waned, eventually closing in 1956. But for a time, Charles Worth wasn't just a dressmaker. He was the god of fashion, and every Gilded Age woman who mattered worshipped at his altar. While New York and Chicago built their shopping empires, San Francisco had something just as dazzling and just as French. In 1850, two brothers, Felix and Émile Verdier, sailed into San Francisco harbor with trunks full of Parisian goods. At first, the city's ladies literally bought items straight off the ship. Can you imagine that? Instead of a store opening, the dock became a boutique. Forget shopping bags. Your gown might have been passed to you over a ship's rail. Eventually, the Verdiers opened a waterfront store and, by 1896, a new flagship across from Union Square, the City of Paris department store. From the outside, it looked like yet another Gilded Age palace of consumption. But inside was its crown jewel, a spectacular stained glass rotunda, rising above the sales floor like a cathedral dome. If Marshall Field's Tiffany Dome was Chicago's glory, the City of Paris Rotunda was San Francisco. Shopping there wasn't just commerce, it was a civic experience, and the goods, pure Paris. For San Francisco society women, this was salvation. Why endure months of ocean travel when you could simply pop into Union Square and buy the same fashions directly imported from France? The store brought the glamour of Europe to the edge of the American frontier, giving the wives of mining magnates and railroad tycoons access to the same silks and perfumes their East Coast cousins flaunted. But the city of Paris wasn't just about fashion. It became a symbol of sophistication for a city that often felt like a rough-and-tumble boomtown. Think of it as San Francisco's declaration. We may be built on gold mines and earthquakes, but we also know how to wear a Worth gown. The Rotunda became a gathering point for generations of shoppers. In a city that sometimes burned down, rebuilt itself, and burned again, the city of Paris stood as a reminder that refinement could flourish even in chaos. Sadly, like many Gilded Age icons, the city of Paris eventually fell victim to time and economics. In 1972, the store closed. The building was demolished, making way for Neiman Marcus, but the stained glass rotunda, too beautiful to lose, was preserved and still crowns the Neiman Marcus store today, a glowing echo of San Francisco's own palace of luxury. It's almost poetic. Shoppers in the modern Neiman Marcus may never know the rotunda's full story, but it still filters sunlight onto racks of expensive clothes, just as it did for their Gilded Age predecessor. And if you listen closely while standing beneath it, you might almost hear the rustle of silk skirts and the gossip of San Francisco's finest. Before there was Bloomingdale's, before there was Macy's, even before Marshall Field's grand marble halls, there was A.T. Stewart, the man many call the father of the department store. Alexander Turney Stewart was an Irish immigrant who came to New York in the 1820s with more ambition than cash. In 1823, he opened a small dry goods store on Chambers Street. That, in itself, wasn't remarkable. Half of New York seemed to be selling dry goods. What made Stewart different was vision. He realized something few others had. Shopping didn't have to be miserable. Up until then, shopping was like a medieval barter session. You haggled with clerks who usually looked annoyed at your existence, and you shuffled through limited stock in cramped spaces. Stewart decided to elevate the entire experience. In 1846, he built the Marble Palace on Broadway, a grand building with an all-marble facade that looked more like a government institution than a store. Step inside, and suddenly you were in a temple of commerce, with high ceiling, wide aisles, and rows of luxury goods laid out to tempt, not to hide. But Stewart wasn't done. In 1862, he opened his pièce de résistance, the Iron Palace, a 6-story retail colossus with a cast-iron front, glass dome, and some 30 departments. Imagine a shopping mall before shopping malls existed, except this one had the grandeur of a cathedral and the scale of a train station. It was so modern and innovative that people visited just to marvel at the building itself. And Stewart was clever with innovation. He was one of the first to offer fixed prices, no more haggling. He pioneered the mail-order business, letting rural Americans buy goods by catalog, long before Amazon was even a glimmer in Jeff Bezos's great-great-grandparents' eyes. He also believed in advertising, splashing his store's name across newspapers until it became synonymous with luxury. For the Gilded Age elite, A.T. Stewart stores were a must-visit. Shopping there was a status symbol, the place you went to prove not only that you had money, but that you knew how to spend it properly. And for the middle classes, even stepping inside the Iron Palace was aspirational, a glimpse into how the other half lived. Of course, Stewart himself wasn't exactly beloved. He was ruthless, cutting down competitors with the efficiency of a robber baron. But when he died in 1876, he left behind both immense wealth and an empire of retail that paved the way for every department store that followed. Sadly, his empire didn't last. After being sold in 1896, the Iron Palace eventually burned in 1956. The Marble Palace still stands at 280 Broadway, though today it houses offices, a rather anticlimactic fate for the building that once invented modern shopping. Still, A.T. Stewart deserves the credit. He took shopping from a chore to an experience, and in doing so, planted the seeds of the consumer culture that defined the Gilded Age. And, let's be honest, still defines us now. If A.T. Stewart invented the department store, Siegel Cooper perfected the spectacle. Founded in 1887 by Henry Siegel and Frank Cooper in Chicago, Siegel Cooper was already a formidable retailer when they decided to expand to New York. In 1894, they opened what they called simply the Big Store, and they weren't kidding. At 15.5 acres, employing over 3,000 workers, it was the largest department store in the world at the time. And this wasn't just a store, it was a city under one roof. Opening day in 1896 drew an estimated 40,000 frenzied customers. Imagine Black Friday at Walmart, but with corsets and parasols. People rushed through the glass doors to marvel not only at the goods, but at the building itself. Siegel Cooper was ahead of its time, essentially inventing the indoor shopping. It had 124 distinct departments, selling everything from fashion and furniture to bicycles and plants. But that was just the beginning. Inside, you could also find a grocery store, a bank, a post office, a dentist, a doctor, a beauty salon, a barber, a photo studio, even a box office. There was a restaurant, an art gallery, and of course, a fountain in the center where ladies congregated to gossip and be seen. Their slogan was bold, everything under the sun. And for once, it wasn't just advertising. If you needed it, Siegel Cooper had it, or would find a way to make you believe you did. The big store's success was as much about experience as it was about shopping. For middle-class families, it was a day out. For the wealthy, it was another stage to display their grandeur. One reporter at the time quipped that Siegel Cooper's wasn't a store at all, but a cathedral of consumerism, and stepping inside was like entering a new world where luxury and convenience blended seamlessly. But like so many Gilded Age ventures, it was too much, too fast. Henry Siegel overextended himself, and by 1915 he was bankrupt. The big store closed its doors, its vast interior later repurposed as a military hospital, then a warehouse, and eventually a collection of smaller, low-end retail shops. In Boston, their third store became government offices. Still, for a brief moment in the 1890s, Siegel Cooper represented the pinnacle of the Gilded Age dream, that money could buy not just things, but entire experiences. Think of it as the 19th century version of a mall, a theme park, and an amusement ride all rolled into one. If A.T. Stewart's Iron Palace was groundbreaking, Siegel Cooper's big store was outrageous. And let's be honest, if Siegel Cooper had survived into the 21st century, you can bet it would have had its own reality TV show, probably something like The Real Shoppers of Ladies' Mile. If individual stores were palaces, then New York's Ladies' Mile was the kingdom. Stretching along Broadway and 6th Avenue from about 10th Street up to 24th, this district wasn't just a cluster of shops. It was a whole ecosystem of glamour, gossip, and commerce. The name itself said everything. This was the place where society women could stroll, browse, and shop to their heart's content, unaccompanied by men, without risking scandal. Imagine that, shopping as liberation. Today we don't think twice about running to Target alone, but in the 1870s, the idea that a woman could wander publicly without a chaperone was nothing short of revolutionary. The Ladies' Mile became a parade ground for the Gilded Age's retail titan. A.T. Stewart's Iron Palace, Lord & Taylor, Arnold Constable, B. Altman, Siegel Cooper, Tiffany & Cohen's, and later Bergdorf Goodman. Together, they transformed downtown Manhattan into a consumer's fantasyland. Glittering shop windows showcased gowns dripping in lace, elaborate hats bristling with ostrich feathers, and jewels that sparkled so brightly they seemed to compete with the gaslights. The architecture itself was designed to impress. Cast iron facades rose like fortresses, and interiors gleamed with polished wood, brass railings, and skylights that poured light onto displays of satin and silk. For women who had grown up in modest boarding houses or cramped tenements, just walking into one of these stores was like stepping into another universe. And of course, the district wasn't just about goods. It was about spectacle. Strolling down the Ladies' Mile was like scrolling Instagram before Instagram existed, a constant display of wealth, style, and aspiration. Shopkeepers competed for attention with increasingly elaborate window display. One season, it might be a ball gown draped in pearls. The next, a stage scene with mannequins posing as if frozen mid-dance. People came not only to buy, but to see and be seen. Naturally, there was irony built into all this glamour. While wealthy shoppers admired gowns costing hundreds of dollars, just a few blocks away, women were working in garment sweatshops for pennies a day, stitching the very dresses that twirled in the windows. It was capitalism's split screen, the dream on one side, the exhaustion on the other. But for all its contradictions, the Ladies' Mile had a real cultural impact. It gave women more independence, more mobility, and more influence over family spending. Shopkeepers knew this, and they tailored everything from window displays to sales pitches toward women. In many ways, the Ladies' Mile was a training ground for modern consumer culture, where identity and status became wrapped up in what you bought and where you shopped. By the 1920s, the district began to decline as department stores moved uptown, but its legacy lived on. Today, many of those cast-iron buildings still stand, repurposed into lofts, offices, and chain stores, echoes of an era when New York's Ladies' Mile was the center of a glittering universe. So, what do we take away from this parade of luxury, extravagance, and retail innovation? The Gilded Age's great department stores weren't just shops. They were cultural landmarks, symbols of aspiration, and theaters of wealth. They gave women unprecedented independence, introduced the concept of fixed prices and modern advertising, and made shopping an experience rather than a chore. They also mirrored the era's contradictions, dazzling opulence on one side, grueling poverty and labor on the other. Bloomingdale's still thrives. Marshall Field's name lives on only in nostalgia. Harrods and Harvey Nichols glitter in Knightsbridge, and the House of Worth survives mostly in history books. The city of Paris has vanished, though its stained glass rotunda still filters San Francisco light. Siegel Cooper's big store is long gone, but its ghost lingers every time we step into a mall. And the Ladies' Mile? Today, it's a reminder that shopping has always been about more than buying. It's about identity, performance, and dreams. In the Gilded Age, buying a gown or a necklace was never just about the object. It was about saying, I belong, I have arrived, look at me, or better yet, envy me. And here's the kicker. In many ways, we're still living in that same mindset. The stores may have changed, but the impulse hasn't. Whether it's Harrods in 1890 or Instagram boutiques today, shopping remains both spectacle and self-expression. Only the escalators got faster, and nobody hands out brandy at the top anymore, which feels like a real missed opportunity. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, picture the glittering shop windows of the Gilded Age, the rustle of silk gowns in the Ladies' Mile, and the hush of awe as someone rode an escalator for the very first time. Because at the end of the day, the story of shopping in the Gilded Age wasn't about things. It was about dreams and the price people were willing to pay for them. Written by Clara Finch, because women's stories always deserve a soul.